It's really interesting to compare and contrast the way that the coronavirus in Canada was first discussed at the end of January when the first case had emerged here, and how it's being discussed now at the beginning of March. Really tragicomic. And I say that because there's some odd humor in how we like to deal with political issues in Canada, although tragic, of course, because this is a serious issue. There are people dying around the world. So let's backtrack about 5 weeks. January 25th was the day where there's a press conference in Ontario to say we have our first case. Now, at the time, we knew even less about the virus than we do now. Still a lot of unanswered questions about it, but it seems medical experts have a bit more of a handle on things. Back then, just 5 weeks ago, we didn't know, is this thing just going to suddenly flare up and massively infect many people in Canada? A lot of people were very concerned, particularly there were parents in the North GTA and communities like Markham that had a sizable Chinese Canadian population, and they were concerned, those Chinese parents, about what this would mean for their community and their children and their schools, because they knew that their neighbors, many of them, had gone back to China for the Lunar New Year, even some of them to the Wuhan area, and would be returning. They were concerned about what this meant in terms of spreading the virus, and there was a major petition that said, hey, maybe we can ask children coming back from the Wuhan area to not be allowed to attend school for 2 weeks. Now, interestingly enough, that is, of course, what we are pretty much asking everybody to now do, returning from China, Iran, and Italy, calling for self-quarantine. It's just a logical thing to do. How things have changed over 5 weeks. If you were to propose that idea now, politicians, public health authorities would all nod and say, yes, that is what we recommend, self-quarantine. But oh no, 5 weeks ago, there was a word for that. That was racism. That was intolerance. Toronto Mayor John Tory standing at a podium and bizarrely saying that there have been people who have been calling for quarantining Chinese Canadians, as if it was a call to quarantine people based on their ethnicity, their heritage, rather than the fact that they had just returned from that affected area. And of course, he missed the fact that it was largely Chinese Canadian parents who were the ones calling for that to happen in the first place. It's really funny. I mean, these days in politics in North America, it's just such a cheap and easy thing to do sort of social justice, virtue signaling over these various identity politics issues. It's the first thing they reach for. It gets them a lot of retweets. It gets them a lot of applause from the activists. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit of politics this day and age, and that is what Mayor John Tory and other politicians reached for instantly with the coronavirus story. 5 weeks later, that is, of course, what we are doing, and the federal government even quarantined returnees from Wuhan for 2 weeks at a military base, and nobody batted an eyelash about it, because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. Of course, it was a reasonable thing to do, and we're seeing other measures being brought into place. We're now talking about whether or not one should be banning flights from places like Italy and South Korea. Public health officials now saying because it is flaring up in the United States, it may be a moot point about all of this, the containment issue. They more want to deal with stopping community spread and other facets. But it doesn't change the fact that, well, John Tory and others like him who were chastising people and saying the big concern here is not the coronavirus, but people refusing to eat in Chinese restaurants. These would probably mostly be Chinese people who were already frequenting Chinese restaurants, deciding that they didn't want to go out at that period for whatever reason, that those are the real villains. That is the real problem. And you want to roll your eyes at all of this. And, in other situations, in other public policy matters, in other moments, all right, it's okay to sacrifice whatever the issue is to the altar of political correctness. But public health? Really? I think that is the one issue that we should be able to put all of the social justice antics behind and just look at the facts and assess it all. I hope that that little period there when we were virtue signaling about the issue did not cause the virus to further spread in Canada. Seems like we've actually fared pretty well because we had that first case in January 25th. 5 weeks later, there's only a couple dozen, whereas back in January 25th, Iran and Italy didn't even have a single case. So looks like it didn't really get in the way of how the whole system unfolded in public health protocols in Canada. But the fact that that was their priority when we were dealing with a serious issue, well, that's unfortunate.